So without further ado, here goes Nancy.
Thanks, everyone. I am really, really excited to be here. So let's see. So again, my name is Nancy Douyon. I am a user experience researcher at Google. And as you can see, I have this little image of what Google looks like if we were all cartoon figures. And I'm hoping to share with you guys a little bit about understanding how people think and feel to make better products. So what we're going to talk about today are some of these psychological principles. And during the seminar, I'm going to encourage you to think like you are a psychologist. Ask yourself the questions, why do people, including myself, do the things that they do? And we're also going to constantly ask ourselves, why do users do the things, also try to ask ourselves why users behave in the way that they do. So psychologists traditionally study human behavior, and we have this thought that, that typically we assume that thoughts and feelings lead to behavior. But a lot of times, behavior is caused by some of the thoughts and feelings that we design in some of our interfaces. And so we're going to go ahead and tell a little story about where I came from and how I actually kind of got here. So I am originally from Boston by way of Haiti, so I grew up in both places. Haiti is a country in the Caribbean between Cuba, Jamaica, and Puerto Rico. And my parents are farmers there. And so actually most of my family are farmers there. So coming to America and learning how to deal with things in America has been really interesting, especially seeing how they understood how to use things. So it's always been really important to me to really get a great understanding of why, for example, why my parents misunderstood a lot of the things that were American products or why it didn't work in certain markets. And so emerging markets has become a really important part of my life. I went to University of Michigan, and after Michigan, I worked at places like Intel, Accenture, IBM, and now I work at Google. So I said I was a user experience researcher, but I don't know if any of you guys have heard of Project Phi. Has anyone heard of that? It literally came out about 2 weeks ago at Google. So I mostly work on secret projects, but now that Phi is public, it's basically a wireless communication service, sort of like, is it Vodafone that you guys have here? So Google has actually launched their own wireless communication, and that's one of the products that I work on. I actually work on designing support features or the idea of support for this product. Since Google is moving to spaces of more services, here is a space that we're really trying to recreate and rethink how people get help with different products, whether that's learning in a subliminal way or leading someone to find help through a call center, things like that. How do we redesign those experiences? And just a little bit about what Project Phi does that's different than other wireless communication. You're actually able to use your device and access calls on any device that's, as long as you're connected to your Google account. So if my phone rings over there, it's also going to ring on my laptop or my tablet. I can answer it anywhere, and as well, there's seamless transfer between wireless and other. Sorry, I thought I heard somebody. Can you guys hear me fine? Yeah. Okay, great. Seamless transfers between wireless and your carrier. So imagine walking around and being able to go into your home and easily switching onto Wi-Fi and then walking out and switching onto your carrier. So we're going to start off by talking about focusing on the user. We've heard a lot about this today. And Larry Page, he's the CEO of Google, says that there is no substitute for personally watching and listening to the real people. This is very, very, very true. And you can see in this example, if you imagine you have your child in their crib and they have these rotating images around their bed, around their cradle, right? There might be a car or airplane, things like that. If we weren't thinking about the user, we'd think this is amazing. They're gonna love these little toy things above them. But if you are considering viewing this as if you were a user, this is actually what it probably looks like to a baby, right? So they don't see cars, and if they think these are cars, that's a really disappointment. So it's really important that we understand users because that's really what's central to user experience design. And so today, we're going to walk through a lot of these important parts, and I'm going to give you some anecdotes and some stories related to my own experiences and watching my parents trying to understand things in different places. So the goal here is to shift your perspective, which is actually better than just building smart things. So a lot of you guys might be developers here. It's really interesting working with developers who are really, really pretty smart, and also designers who are really, really, really smart, who we really need to work with to shift their perspective to really design for who our users are. So we're gonna do a story, right? You guys are gonna represent this guy, Thomas, right? And Thomas is looking out the window because he's trying to figure out the weather in Washington. He's leaving Johannesburg and moving to Washington, and weather is really, really important to him. So we're gonna see if we can redesign the experience of looking at weather with the psychological principles that I'm gonna present to you today. So this is basically what he's looking at when he's trying to figure out what Washington State, he's going to University of Washington, and he wants to know the weather, and this is the information he gets. It's a lot to digest, and he really just kind of wants to figure out some details about the day-to-day and what to expect when he gets there. He's not there yet, but what he's gonna expect maybe down the line. So the first thing we want to do is really take a look at his point of view, or the user's point of view, and this breaks down into who the user is, right, being specific about that segment, what their needs are, and also what their insights are. And we're going to a little bit more information about that. And we're going to be filling out this form as we go along to help us really get a good picture of who Thomas is and what we're trying to design for him. So we'll start off with context. Context has always been something that's been very important in my life. Coming to this country and trying to learn how words mean things, I've always used the context clues around them, the words that kind of suggest what things mean. So I remember, for example, I was trying to figure out what the word virgin meant because my parents were adamant about me reading this Bible, right? And the dictionary told me it meant something about to copulate, which meant something about intercourse, which meant something about sex, which also meant to copulate. So I learned nothing, really. And asking my parents was gonna give me any information because they were horrified. I was about 8 at the time. And so context in this case, right, is looking at the scenario, really looking at who the user is, some ethnographic information about who they are, and what the user's behavior is. And sometimes that can mean the physical environment that they're in, whether they are on a mobile device or through using a mobile setting, or if they're on a desktop computer, or sometimes it's because of it's looking at a specific use case, what the intent of the application is, or specific needs and wants of the application, for the applications. So think places, think times, think tools, think devices, think understanding the moment, and think understanding circumstance. So I'll give you an example. We're gonna take a look at Google Maps. Maybe some of you guys have used this before or seen this before. It's interesting that the way users use Google Maps on the desktop is very different from the way they'll use it on their mobile device. As you can see, if you log into here and add some information, it doesn't give you turn-by-turn directions, at least not anymore, to get to what you need, because normally when people are going on a desktop to see things, they want to see big picture. Now, if they want more details, they can go and search further, but this is a snapshot really of what they're looking for. Whereas if they were on their device, they would probably need turn-by-turn directions right away because the context is different, right? So it's really, really important that when we're considering designing different things, really think about who the user is, what their circumstances, and what their needs are. In this case as well, this is just a little fun ad that Google had. They decided to kind of combine your calendar with what's going on the map. So I can literally see around my area what events are gonna happen and what time they're gonna happen. So by my house, it sometimes even tells me when I'm going to go to work and sends me reminders. So I wanna give a reference that's more related to South African stuff. Do you guys know what OneDrop is? Does anyone know what that is? Well, OneDrop is a carrier service. Courier service. Very similar to Uber for paperwork. Imagine that, but that's a very South African thing. We don't actually have OneDrop in America because we don't use courier services, but this is something that's actually very relevant to folks who live in this area. So they went along and also built the ability for you to use this on their mobile device, really considering the context of somebody who's working or trying to get somebody to pick up some package and bring it to someone else. So really looking at the context of, okay, where are you going? Instead of where you are right now, where do you need this package picked up? And also, where does it need to be dropped off? And it gives you confirmation for those things. So really interesting service, very, very important for the context of using it here. So if we go back to our character, we're gonna say, Thomas, in his context, we're just gonna keep it simple, he hates being cold. That's the only context that we have, it's an important thing, but this will help us in designing something for this weather application. The other thing I mentioned with OneDrop, you might have noticed, were these cultural practices, right? There are things that are done in different places that may not be done like in the US. So for example, we went off to India to do some research on music players and understanding why folks in India wouldn't use our players the way our iTunes or Google Play. And the result of that showed that Indian folks search music by movie. So there was two ways that we could look at this. We could force them to learn what soundtracks were, or we could actually redesign the tools so that it fit for that market. And there's lots of examples of this. And so the courier service, in the example I showed earlier, relates to something that South Africans might do. So this is where we're really looking at how we consider human values and what's important in different places. I told a story yesterday at a meetup as well that I was in Ghana working with a kid, a 15-year-old, who wanted to show me his app, and he had a shopping cart on there. And he couldn't complete the shopping cart task, but he said if I gave him some time, he would fix the shopping cart area and send it my way. And I asked him if he knew what a shopping cart was. I also asked him if he knew what a floppy disk was on the save sign to see if he knew much about the history. And he said he didn't know what a shopping cart was. And I asked him, is this something that your family uses? And I wanted him to really start to understand his own story and trying to design for his own folks, right? And so actually what his family does is they go into the village and they barter. So in this case, instead of designing a system for himself that would have a shopping cart, something very identical to what is done in America, it actually made more sense for him to design something that would be more useful for his community. And in fact, not only would that be useful for his community, but that would also kind of probably spread across all of Africa, India, the Caribbean. A lot of communities actually use a bartering system, but you don't see that built into a lot of tools. So I'll give you an example of something, again, in the US that I found very different in South Africa, or in certain banks with South Africa. This is my bank account, my personal account information. So you'll see that really all you can do here is see accounts, make payments for bills, transfer money, and that's really about it. When I asked my friend to send me a copy of what his bank account looks like in South Africa, he showed me this, which is interesting, because you can purchase airtime, you can, what was that? You can send SMS, you have all these things that are really very particular to the community here. So this probably isn't something that we would use in America, but it's really, really important that if we're designing things, really to consider who your community is and not really copying what's done someplace else. I know we do a lot of competitive evaluations and comparative evaluations, but also making sure that you consider who the users are that are around you that you are serving. So back to Thomas. He hates being cold and he's going to Washington. So that's some more context and information that we can use here. So there's some culture here, and there's also information about his context. And we're gonna move on to goals. What are the user goals? I actually now am a huge soccer fan, but when I started playing soccer when I was younger, I kept asking my mother why there was a goalie in the way, goalkeeper in the way, because I just wanted to get the ball in, and I had no idea what the purpose of him being there. And so I switched over to bowling for a while because there was nothing in the way. But in this case, that doesn't apply to that. But really looking at the tasks and objectives, and not only the context, but how important it is and how much time is available, understanding what people are trying to accomplish. So some goals, sometimes we know what the task is, but we're not clear what the objectives are. And it's helpful to match tasks to user goals and values and urgency. So you want to consider their value, urgencies, and other things. So let's take a look about contextual inquiries. Does anyone here know what a contextual inquiry is? Maybe a couple of you do. So I'm a really, really big fan of actually trying to solve for the real problem, right? I get a lot of folks that come to me and tell me what they think the problem is or what the goal of the user is, and a lot of the times it's incorrect, right? So let's say the problem is a user doesn't want to brush their teeth, and they'll just come to me and say, well, we think it's because the water is too hot, so let's solve for that problem. A contextual inquiry takes a step back and actually does some research. Really, you can do it in half a day and ask stakeholders different questions about who these users are, how they interact with users, and you can start to collect information and even create diagrams, such as an affinity diagram, to start to see what the real problems and issues are that we're trying to solve for. And a lot of the time, that's what uncovers the bigger issues within a product or a project or a service. So, in thinking about some of the user's goals, if you're designing something like this, does this fit this user's goal? Yes, no? Right, no. Good. Let's try something that actually is maybe more relevant to interface design. So we had this placed in front of users to figure out how they would use it. Do you really want to cancel this upload? And the goal is to cancel this upload. What do? Do you click cancel? Do you click OK? Do you click the X at the top? You'd be surprised. Maybe some of you guys get this pretty quickly. A lot of folks just hesitate and they do nothing and then sometimes walk away, you know, and solve nothing because then they're too afraid to push anything because they don't know if they'll lose something because maybe they don't want to cancel anymore, you know? You don't want the user to sit there and wait. You don't want the user to think, right? You want them to be able to get to their goal or to complete their task as quickly as possible. I asked a friend of mine to send me some interfaces in South Africa to see if I could figure out myself what goals some sites are trying to accomplish by looking at them. So here's one. Does anyone know what this site is? Anybody? Does anybody know the goal that this site is trying to accomplish? So this is the South African censorship site. Does that seem obvious from looking at this? Really, really hard to figure out. I mean, I really didn't know what to do. It was pretty. It's really attractive. But I really couldn't understand really what my goal is when I got here. And if I did have a goal, how I would accomplish that quickly through this site. I will give another example that a friend sent me. Do you guys know what this is? So, I didn't know that you guys get licenses for TVs, TV services. That was interesting to me, so I had a lot of fun exploring this site, but what shocked me about this site is that every time I clicked on something, it downloaded a PDF. Is that common out here? I explored other sites, and the same thing kept happening, that every time I clicked something, it said, you know, I could pay or do something, but it would download a PDF that I would then have to send to someone. Completely did not meet what the expectations are, didn't reach my goals, and half the time I didn't even do anything with it, right? So I've been told that there's a bunch of people who just don't get the licenses and they buy TVs anyway. I'm not really sure 100% how that works, but maybe that's okay. That's probably what I would apt to do. So the other thing is you want to also make sure that if you can't give the user what they want, that you can at least make that clear to them too, right? Page not available, but just it is. Still delightful. So let's move into something that you guys probably do know about. I do know about this train. Is it pronounced Gautrain? Yes. Train. I'm probably saying it wrong. So we took a look at this app. Pretty simple. I don't know if any of you guys use this app. Do any of you guys use this app? I see a few hands using it. And I wanted to know if this could be streamlined in some way and meet the user goals faster. What is the user trying to do? And it turns out there's another app, and I apologize for the quality of this image, called GT Buddy. Do you guys know what this app is? Has anyone used this? This actually is a lot easier to use. Does it look easier to use? Does it, just kind of going back and forth, there's something about it that just feels like it accomplishes a goal faster. It seems like it's something that's more usable. It also seems to deliver things that users might actually want. So if I regularly know what time my train arrives or goes, I can have that right on the desktop of my Android device. On the screen of my Android device. So really taking a look at what you've already built and could it be improved to meet user needs faster. I do a lot of testing, benchmark testing, to see how long it takes people to do things. So I'll sometimes set up a goal. If somebody can't get to something in 3 clicks, then it's a failed design, right? And so I'll set some labs up or do even a hallway usability study, which is literally getting anybody off the street or in the hallway, putting on top of on an app and saying, okay, tell me how you would do this. And ask a few users, and if it doesn't accomplish it, or if I see them, for example, clicking on a blank space, I know there's something I need to do there. So back to Thomas. We now know he hates cold weather, and he hates being cold in Washington, and his goal is to find an easy way to check weather, right? Something easy that maybe pops up often. He just wants it to be easier than the way, with the image we showed before, looks. We're gonna move into perception. Perception is really interesting. Do you guys see this? Do you see 2 faces? Pretty cool, right? So perception is another very interesting thing in my life. My parents, growing up, used to believe, again, farmers, middle school educated, they used to believe the bigger the book, the smarter I would be, right? And they thought the thicker the cover, the more intellectual the book was. So here I am, 8, reading the most complicated, horrific things in some cases that had nothing to do with what my parents believed. They also believed that if you opened the fridge, that you would get pneumonia. If you had your bare feet on the floor, you would get pneumonia. In fact, if you touched anything, you would get pneumonia. They weren't used to cold weather at all, so they just feared for their children's lives. So when I would visit people's homes, American folks' homes, and I would see kids open their refrigerators, I was like, these parents just don't care about their kids. This is crazy, right? So again, it was so interesting to me in growing up with them, and I used to think they would lie to me, but the things they just perceived from seeing how people did things, it's just, that was how they understood it. That was the quickest, easiest way for them to understand it. So you really want to think about, can people see, hear, or feel the experience? You want to think about, can they recognize and identify information and opportunities? And does it draw any attention at the right time? So we do a lot of observation to figure out perception. Here's 2 lines. Have you guys seen this before? Which line is longer? Raise your hand if it's the first one, top one. Okay, I see 1. Raise your hand if it's the bottom. I see a couple. Raise your hand if you think they're both the same size. All right, you guys are smart. So these lines are actually both the same size, right? But a lot of people perceive one to be longer just because of the way it's designed, right? So let's try something else. This is my experience in South Africa. For the love of God, every time I see a door with a handle, I want to open the door, I want to pull it open, and people will come up to me and say, no, you push, right? No one reads. I think you guys know this. Nobody reads anything, right? So there has to be some way for us to be able to understand how to get through a door and open it very easily, right? There's this thing called affordances, right? It's basically actions that the design have, or that it suggests the user to do things, like turning on a bottle or pushing. You know, there are certain things or visual cues that make users do things, and I test this on children. Like I have an activity that I call affordance models, where I have kids just build things that turn and push and pull, and then give it to their parents, and their parents will see all this junk, and they're like, I don't know what this is, but they're doing the actions without realizing that there's affordances, there's designs in them that we just kind of know. And I've done this in many countries, and it turns out like pushing, pulling, and turning is some actions that are, it's a human factor that all of us have. So this is a lot easier to understand, a flat surface to push and a handle to pull. A lot easier to understand. Let me give you an example that a lot of folks got confused with in the States. Okay, so how do you get out? What do you do? Do you leave this exit? Do you run away? What will happen? Does anyone know? See, the fact that you guys are even thinking about it is a failed design to me, right? So I've watched people at this door, I mean, I literally just sit and observe them and just watch them think. They will just stand there and just try to make life or death decisions, whether to walk out this door or not, or what will happen, will the building go down, will an alarm ring, will they be embarrassed? A lot of times it's just unclear. You have two opposing instructions here that don't make sense. Let's try another design. This is a stovetop. Can anyone tell me how to turn on the top left corner? Does anyone know? I hear some people saying. So is it the first knob or the second knob? Second knob? So my parents have this in their house, and I mean, we've had this forever, right? And for the love of, every time they go in front of this thing, they always just guess, you know? And they've been doing this forever. There's little cues there with little colored dots that say, well, you know, this red dot means it's the top right corner or something like that. And my parents refused to see them, and for years have been doing the same thing over and over again, trying to figure this out. This is how easy this design is to fix. Now tell me how to turn on the top left. Right. Really interesting in how you can move things around and make things really easy for the user so they don't have to think. Something like this, my parents would come in, do their thing, and get out, save a few seconds. Let me give you another design. Here we have this machine in a grocery store in the States, right? You swipe your credit card and you go on your merry way. This is supposed to be easier than standing in line with a clerk. You can do some self-service here, or even if you're with somebody who's serving you, this should be easier. Tell me what might be confusing about this design. Is there anything confusing? Does it seem straightforward? So I'm gonna step closer to it. It says credit, so it's asking if it's a credit payment. It says the payment, and then it says okay. So there is no button that says okay, right? So what ends up happening is most people will click on the green button because it feels like a go and it says enter. A lot of other people will see where it says credit, okay, and press on the button that says credit. And other folks will see the debit button and see the arrow that's pointing to okay and click on that, right? Very, very, very confusing. These are things that you can pick up in user testing to see what's useful and what's not, and what we can start to do to redesign things so that it makes more sense to people. In this case, it might just make more sense to have a button that says okay. This is Street Store. Do you guys know about this? This is also really interesting. So I showed this to my team at Google. So Street Store started in South Africa. And it's this amazing concept where we're looking at giving clothes to homeless and redesigning it to give it a more dignifying experience, and also just kind of creating something that makes people feel like they're not just being thrown a bag. It's a lot more useful, and this is an amazing concept. It actually has blown up, and it's all over the world now. And what's amazing about this is, with some folks who see this process, there's something about it that makes them perceive that they should give more. Something about this neat layout that makes them want to come back and give more. And there's folks who will grab things. This is all free. This is a free pop-up store, right? There are folks who will come back and return things after they've used them just because of the convenience of this and the experience that they have. And the fact that in general, this is such a dignified experience, instead of handing somebody a bag of clothes and having somebody shift through them. So we're gonna go back to Thomas. Now we've got perception laid down. He wants to use as little brain as possible, right? So we've got weather he's interested in. He hates being cold in Washington. He wants to check weather easily, and he wants to use as little brain usage as possible. So let's move on and talk about motivation. What motivates people? This is the force that initiates, directs, and sustains behavior. What drives people to do what they do? What are they trying to get out of interaction with a product or a person? Really, what makes you kind of keep coming back to things over and over again? So let's take a look at Facebook, for example. Is there anybody here who doesn't have a Facebook account? All right, there's a few of you. You probably are wise about this. This is a tool that is designed to just kind of keep you there forever. From some of you who have experienced trying to leave Facebook. What's interesting about Facebook is Facebook and things like Pinterest, other tools that make folks kind of keep returning, they use different things that we know in motivation keeps people around. So in the case of this, one thing that keeps people around is achievement, right? The ability to brag about their achievements. Or in the case of Pinterest, which is kind of like a scrapbook for photos, you're showing off all the great things you know or you do, right? That's something that keeps people returning. Another thing is affiliation. Being able to connect with other people who have the same likes as you, or and in this case, being able to connect with people that you haven't seen for a long time, or that you can reach out more in Facebook than you might see them regularly online. You can see what they're doing, get updates on them, spy, all that great stuff. And then there's this idea of power, which is really interesting. That's like the number of likes you have, right? Or the number of followers that you have. Some people come just because it makes them feel good to know that someone out there loves me. And I have all this power. And the other thing is, not only do they love me, that must mean there's something about me. It makes me feel more powerful or more wise, or it confirms or validates me because I have the most likes or the most followers. So I'm gonna stay on this or keep coming back to see how many more people like a quote I put up or something like that. So what motivates users? Is it sensation? Is it pleasure? Anticipation? That's hope. Is it social cohesion? Acceptance? A lot of those things that you have to think about. I've been told that To Go, do you guys use To Go here? Does anyone use To Go? What an interesting audience. Only because I've asked about this. I've heard that this is something that's really addictive out here. Maybe it's not. But To Go is something that looks at Facebook and GChat and puts it together, and it has a number of users. It just has a growing number of users. It's blown up pretty heavily in South Africa, and I think that it's probably blowing up across Africa as well. I need to get some more information about that, though. Let's use another example. This is called Zlatos. This actually doesn't fully exist yet, but a friend of mine's actually started this Zlato exchange. It's virtual currency for social good. So what he's trying to do here is motivate people to basically get more education by giving them virtual currency to basically pay for transportation or pay for food. So the idea is that you're learning a lot more about virtual currency. I've been told that a lot of folks still really kind of cling on to cash here. Cash is a behavior, whereas in the States, a lot of folks are using things like Venmo, PayPal, a lot of virtual currency. So this is kind of an introduction or a way to get people to start thinking a lot about virtual currency, and also a motivator that you can get paid to get your transportation or to pay for food by learning and coming to these classrooms and getting as much education as you can. So think about what motivates people to learn, and this being a different tactic. So now back to Thomas. So he wants to use a little brain usage, and we know one of the things that motivate him is kind of anticipation. He wants to know what's going on right away. And we're gonna go on to emotion. So, just a little story. I remember the first time I took my mother to go see a waterfall in Oregon. I was working at Intel at the time, and I was so excited, and my mother was very, very frustrated. She did not want to drive out 2-3 hours to go anywhere. And we get to this waterfall, and I'm like, Mom, isn't it beautiful? And she looks at it and goes, you act like I've never seen water before, right? Then we go into the gift shop, because I felt like I wasted 2 to 3 hours of my time to take her to this place, and she runs to me and sees a cup that has a picture of a waterfall, and she's like, Nancy, look, there's a waterfall on the cup. That was more exciting to her than seeing the actual waterfall. Anyway, so emotion here, we're looking at how do people feel about the experience and their outcomes, right? Are they feeling consistent with their expectations? Are the feelings consistent with their expectations? Are their feelings of the experience good, neutral, bad? We really, when we do our studies, we start collecting information about their pain points, right? And what do we do about the pain that they experience from different area? We start to figure out bright spots, opportunities for things, and then we have like these 10x ideas. Like in the case of Thomas, if he could ideally have whatever he wanted, he could sit in front of his computer and just experience the weather in Washington at whatever time he wanted. The interesting thing about 10x ideas, Google's really big on this, we like to think to the next level, because we really do believe that everything is achievable, right? So we come up with these extreme ideas and try to work towards them, and we end up coming up with some pretty fantastic stuff. So I say this only to encourage you guys not to toss away these dreams of really, really big concepts that seem unachievable, because really we're getting to a place where a lot of these things can be achieved. The driverless car, we're hover vehicles. I don't know if you guys heard of Iris, the contact lens that we have that is trying to battle diabetes. So it basically uses your tears to pick up the glycolysis levels in your blood. Apparently your tears are a bit better to figure out what's going on with your glycolysis levels. And it's less painful, right? Pricking your finger. There's a chip in the actual contact lens. So it's really about taking a look at these neutral experiences and trying to get them to another level. So maybe you guys feel just okay now, but how can we create these experiences for you that create better emotional experiences? We don't want people to go backwards and get frustrated. That's something that I deal with the support world a lot. I mean, once you get to the point where you need help, you're probably pretty frustrated. So what can I do, or what can I put in place to create more positive experiences or design positive experiences? And the other thing about positive experiences is that we found that it actually improves learning, right? So one of the things that I've been working on is looking at how do people get the full use of their products. I don't know if you guys have ever had like a phone for a year and then find out a year later that it could do other things, right? How do we introduce this ability to learn new things within your product? So we're going to take a look at what great design looks like from this emotional perspective. It's looking at visceral design, which is how it makes you feel. Looking at behavioral design, which is how it helps you do things. And then looking at reflective design, which says what it says about you. So some things about visceral design. This is where it's attractive, it's bright, it's colorful, it gives you a sweet taste, you feel warm inside, really a visceral appeal. So some examples are color and how that impacts you. And I always tell folks, please be careful with color and know what you're doing with it, because there are some folks that will put some things together and they will look very interesting. You know? So really looking at color theory and making sure something makes sense to your users. There are times that we've done studies where we'll see how different shades of blue will impact people, you know? Or sometimes we'll even study how different voices, like a male's voice or a woman's voice, on a system when you call in, how that impacts people and if that's a different feeling. Then we can also take a look at layout. Have you ever seen a meal that was just absolutely gorgeous and you just felt just wonderful? You know, maybe before eating it, maybe you didn't even want to touch it. There's something about designing things and the layout that can also create experiences that make you feel more positive. And there's something about sleek curves also. I talked about this yesterday at my meetup. I gave this example. I was working on a consulting project with a company called Baxter, which makes basically mechanical body parts or medical devices. I was working on a kidney at the time, and I was working on the system that would communicate with the kidney and let doctors know if there were any issues. So basically, imagine a doctor from home getting alert, hearing there was a problem with a kidney, and from his home, he would be able to basically fix it. Really kind of cool stuff, right? The client that I had asked me to make the product more Apple-y. So in this case, Apple-y to him meant curves and sex appeal and whatever he felt Apple made him feel every time he came in front of it. After doing some tests, we actually found that making things more Apple-y made more distractions for the doctors. So literally, for every curve, we lost 2 seconds, which could impact somebody's life. So in the case of making folks, delighting them or making positive experiences, keep in mind who your audiences are. If it means killing someone, that's probably not a place that you want to start adding pretty colors and curves. And then the other thing is like warmth. Feelings of warmth. There's a lot of things that we do at Google that create these delightful, warm experiences. So for example, if you use GChat at all, and you write LOL or something funny or happy birthday, some image will pop up laughing, or some image will now pop up saying happy birthday or getting excited for you. Different feelings or different things that just kind of feel a little warm inside, you know, give you a little tingle. So then there's reflective design. This is looking at maybe your memories or exclusivity, perceived rarity, personal satisfaction, prestige, and self-image. So some examples of things that remind you of where you're from. Maybe you'll have paraphernalia that says South Africa on it, and that gives you positive feelings, right? Or self-image. Maybe you buy a watch specifically because of the way it makes you feel. Or maybe you even buy a dog or a pet because of the way it feels or the fact that it reminds you of yourself. And then the last thing is behavioral design, which is looking at efficiency, learnability, practicality, safety, and utility. And I have one example here. Twitter decided to do some experimenting, and they thought it might be interesting while people were tweeting to also, about the Cricket World Cup, to also give them information about the World Cup at the same time to see how people would respond to that. It actually was a very, very, very successful design, and they're actually looking at trying to figure out how they can continue to work on different designs for soccer and other matches, or matches that have fewer commercials, to get opportunities to give people information and also have folks communicate with each other at the same time. So now back to Thomas again. Oops, sorry, let me just add this last thing about empathy. So it's really important that we do test things out on other users that aren't ourselves. I have this thing about, not just all engineers, but sometimes all the UXers, especially at Google, we kind of have the same kind of mindset, right? So we don't do all testing, for example, on the people next door. I know earlier somebody asked, how does Apple do testing when they're super secretive, right? Actually, because I've spoken to many Apple employees, what they do is they'll test it on their own friends and family, or mostly family. So they can kind of keep it in-house. But that can sometimes change the experience of the product, right? I always argue that if we're testing things with just the locals in San Francisco, what does that mean about the products that we're delivering out? So we will go out and do focus groups, we will go out and do remote studies, which is going to other cities that represent more of the entire population of the United States, or sometimes we'll even go and do at-home studies to really truly experience how it feels to be using our products in your day-to-day. Okay, back to Thomas again. So we know he hates being cold. He's going to Washington. He wants to check the weather regularly. He wants to be delighted. He has a lot of anticipation, and he wants to use very little brain usage, which is perfect for us to go into cognitive stuff. So are people able to understand or make use of and remember the experience and the information they have received? And are they able to make good decisions or correct choices? So this is a really interesting model of how our mind works, how sensation impacts you, perception impacts you, attention. And I want to go into a pretty cool example of how our minds can work without us. I'm really looking at human factors, how our minds work even if we don't give you instruction, right? So let's talk about mobile devices. I'm not sure if it does it here, but if you have credit on your phone and your phone credit is about to run out, do you guys hear beeps? Like a few beeps? Did anyone ever tell you what those beeps meant? Did you guys read instructions on them? I'm assuming most people did not, right? There was just something that told you after hearing them, there was a learning curve, right? That if I hear maybe 3 beeps, oh, that means you've got 5 seconds to speak or call me back. Another thing that we do in my country, in Haiti at least, is we do something, they kind of call it beeper. So if I don't really have that many minutes on me, I will ring somebody once. Most people know not to pick up on the first ring, right? And they know if I hang up, that means I ain't got no money. Please call me, right? These weird, really interesting things that we create that don't have any instructions, but we design them so that we can make our experiences a lot easier and help us understand different things. So I'm gonna go into a bunch of different scenarios, for example. Let's start with libraries. In the States, I don't believe this holds true here because I tested this out yesterday. In the States, when you're in a library, there are no signs that tell you to lower your voice. When you're in a museum, there are no signs that tell you to lower your voice. But people lower their voice. When you ask people why they lower their voice, most people will say, well, that's because everybody else is being quiet or whispering. This is actually not true. What's actually happening is when we hear echoing, it literally makes us, when you hear yourself, it literally makes you feel self-conscious and you start to lower your voice, right? So there's something about echoing at least in the States. Last night I went to some spaces that were echoing and people were just screaming. I'm like, I guess this doesn't work everywhere. But at least in the States, this definitely applies, right? I kind of gotta check out the museums out here to see if that applies there too. Or maybe the museums and libraries don't echo out here. Another example, you guys probably maybe have heard of casinos. They paint their walls red to keep you alert. They don't have clocks on the walls on purpose, right, to keep you there longer, and they pump oxygen in the room, right? Maybe you also didn't know that they also lower certain ceilings above certain tables, so it just feels like it's you and the dealer. It makes you feel like no one else is in the room. And they put their most addictive machines by the exits in the bathrooms. Another thing is, let's say you're driving a car. This is an interesting example. You're driving two cars. They're going down a road, and the black car the speed limit, I'm gonna use miles, pardon, because I don't really quite understand kilometers, but the speed limit is 50 miles per hour. The black car is going 75 miles per hour, which is above the speed limit. The red car is going 65 miles per hour. Why did the red car get pulled over before the black car? There's something about red that just makes you think it's doing worse things or going faster, right? At least this holds true back where we are. So I drive a blue car for that purpose. I'm not saying I speed, but sometimes times call. So let's move on to the final details about Thomas. And mind you, Thomas represents not just one person, but a group here. So we know that he also wants reminders. That's something that is important to him because for cognitive reasons. He just wants to know whenever he needs to, what time or when he gets up, what the weather is. So if we put all that together, and you don't want to put it together like that design there, that's bad, right? And we take all this information that we've learned about context, goals, perception, motivation, cognition, and emotion. You may come across taking something like this, taking a look at focusing on the user, changing your perspective, and designing something like this, right? Something that's a lot more delightful, a lot more usable. It actually reaches some of his goals. He'll know, because this is also in an app, when he wakes up, what the weather is gonna be and what to wear. A lot more useful for him. He actually has the ability to go through this and change the settings, right? To say, you know what? At certain degrees, I still feel cold. So you should tell me to put on a sweater, right? Or maybe in certain places, maybe it'll be snowing and I just want to wear shorts or something like that. So this is what happens when you take a lot of these different concepts and really think about creating the best possible user experience. I know that's something that we're trying to do at Google, is look at what we can do to create the best possible user experience. And sometimes that means taking a look at things that have been done for a certain way for a long time and really looking at how we can redesign it and undo some of the learning so that we can create better experiences. So that is the end of my presentation. I actually went a little over, but if you guys have any questions, do I have time for them? All right, I think I have some time for some questions. So this is my LinkedIn and Twitter if you would like to reach out to me as well. Thank you.
Hi, Nancy. Just a question about you. You showed an example of the Gautrain app that they had their original one, and then there was one that was very much based on Google material design.
Right.
And my concern about the future is that, like, where material design is a great asset, it makes a lot of apps look the same. And while it may be more usable, it lacks uniqueness, and the brand loses something in that equation. Just want to know your thoughts on that.
So I should say the app that was designed, it does have some Google references there, but that was actually not a Googler or anybody who designed that. That was somebody who, I guess, designed it based on how Google designed things. I do think that there are some things that you lose with some material design, but I also think that, some of the speakers talked about earlier, trying to create this ecosystem where things make sense across the board. So that's where material design kind of helps and makes sense, if that makes sense to you. So we can take a look at how you can see an app and also see how it fits in other worlds, like in your Google Maps and in your Gmail, and see how you can really bring that world together. And that's really something that we call it the Googleverse that we pay attention to personally. And sometimes it does make things easier, and sometimes making things easier doesn't necessarily make it more understandable. So I think it's really important, and in this case with this design, I haven't actually tested it on a bunch of users. All I know is it's really easy to understand from my own perspective, but I think through some user testing, we would find out if people were able to accomplish their goal better with that design or some other design, or if maybe this doesn't even fit for user needs. Hope that helped.
I'd just like to know, in terms of creating a really good UX department, what are the skill sets that you'd need? Because
Oh, could you speak up a little? I'm sorry.
in creating a good UX department, what are the skill sets that you would need? Because most of the time I realize that when people say UX, what they're actually saying is design. And maybe sometimes design with just a bit of usability studies. But a lot of the stuff is not really part of it. So and I've heard a lot of people talk about marketing background, psychology, all of that. So to have really an effective UX department, what do you think would be a great mix of skills?
Okay, so there's a few things I heard there. I should make clear, UX is not UI, So those are very different. I think when we think about user experience, that is when we start talking about research, and a lot of what I do is taking a look at testing a lot of these designs to see what's useful and what's not useful, and I do take steps further to actually prototype some of these designs to see what fits for certain folks. But you said, I think you asked what collectively are probably the best things, backgrounds, to... So I think, it was hard to hear, but I think you're saying what would be best for like a UX person and a UI designer? Oh, and bringing them all together. Oh, so I didn't really talk a lot about my own background, but I mean, I went to school and I studied human-computer interaction. I also taught design. I have an information systems background and a sociology background before I got into human-computer interaction. And then I also went and started working on a PhD in human factors engineering. There's a number of different ways to get to be a UXer. For me, in my personal opinion, I always think what's most important are the folks that really do care about the users. I meet developers who could be UXers, and I meet designers that could be UXers, but they still have this perspective of, I know what's best for the user. And it's really about removing yourself. And I think that's why you can have really multiple backgrounds and go into UX, because if you can remove yourself from the equation and really design for the people who are paying you, I heard that a little earlier, that's where you can actually make a product that really, really lasts. And so it's beyond just making something that's beautiful, because we've looked at things like an example of healthcare.gov in the States, where originally it was a very, very beautiful design, but you also have to think about functionality, what the user needs are. And so if you can start to get a background in human-computer interaction, I think that's very helpful. But you can also go to Coursera and teach a lot of yourself some of this stuff. Whether it's design or research, a lot of this stuff is available online for folks to learn and to get a foundation to really kind of being well-grounded in both, and also figuring out maybe what you lean towards a little more. We're good? Thank you, everyone.